So we looked at, you missed all that, Teresa. In that case, I'm going to say it all again. Sorry.
I've only just found the button, sorry.
No, you're cool. You're cool. I'm sure no one wants to listen to that again. So that's it. In a sense, our group, Northern Devon for Europe, is having a bit of a watching brief, if you like. We know it's a fait accompli, and we have to make the best, as it were, of what happens in the UK, particularly if it leads to potentially a breakup of the United Kingdom, as is unfolding at the moment in Northern Ireland. But there's one thing for sure: prior to any even thoughts about leaving the European Union, we were all very concerned about any trade deal, global trade deal, from the behemoths, the Syngentas and the global corporations that control our agriculture. We were very keen to ensure that, I suppose they called it the chlorinated chicken argument, that we didn't degrade our environmental standards with any global trade deal. Was it tin cap? I can't remember. What was it? What was that? I don't know. You know what I'm referring to. That was a long battle, which we only just won, as it were. So without more ado, that's plenty from me as an introduction, because, as I say, we have three great speakers. Well, I'm sure that's the case. And Pip, David and Mark are offered 20 minutes to talk to us. And I'll start with an introduction to Pip Howard. Pip's the head gardener at Quince Honey Farm. All I can say is that Quince Honey Farm, hey, that's going to overtake Big Sheep and Milky Way. I'm so sure it's soon as a great attraction, a tourist attraction, quite apart from which it's the most fascinating insight into the whole cycle of bees and pollinators. So Pip, what you don't know about it, well, let's find out. Thank you ever so much for joining us, ladies and gentlemen. I'll mute myself. This is Pip Howard.
Hello, can everyone hear me okay? Is the recording okay? Yep, cool, okay. So I'm much more used to speaking to people rather than online. I am a practitioner, so social media and computer stuff is not in my knowledge. Give you a background as to who I am. I originally trained as a silvicultural surveyor. So whilst I'm given the glorious title of head gardener at Quince Honey Farm, I'm not a gardener, nor is Quince a garden. And I'll come on to explain a bit more about that. So silvicultural surveyor, I'm a tree person, a soils person, did my MSc in soils, and then went off and worked in Europe, based in France for 15 years. Indeed, I actually worked for the EU on FP7 projects as a lead practitioner on soils, and gloriously lost my job when people voted out. A lot of people don't realize that there are quite a lot of us out there who are working where we needed 12 years cover on insurance purposes. So that couldn't be covered by the Brexit arrangements. So we all lost our work. Saying that, though, there were issues. It's all well and good believing the EU were forefront in environmental issues, and certainly they would listen. But there was a lot of problems which we, being British trained, could have helped with, and certainly one of them, I mean, I'll give you a good example. The FP7 projects, you generally have anything from 12 to 20 partners, and we're all meant to be equal within that. One of those partners in some of the schemes I was in with the European Landowners Organization, sounds great, but they were Syngenta. They were paid for by Syngenta. Saying that, being a tree person, the one thing I do want to highlight is probably one of the best things the EU did, and they worked so hard on doing was the European Timber Regulations, EUTR, which is now gone. This was the best method of preventing illegal felling across the globe. It's now no longer relevant in the UK, which is very important because the UK is 5th largest importer of timber. You only now have to go down to frankly, any supermarket or garden centre. You are now looking at illegal timber. I was even tonight following Siberian larchwood van. This is ancient timber. We have plenty of sustainable larch growing in Britain. The Siberian stuff is ancient stuff. We're promised the UKTR will come in and replace it. It hasn't happened. So we are the big baddies. We are now the place where if you want to sell illegal timber, you base yourself here. Going back to what I actually do now. So being a soils man, I met Ian Wallace, and I have to say the Wallace family, their vision is extraordinary. What they want to achieve is not a visitor attraction. It's merely a method of trying to persuade people as to a route forward. And I met Ian on site at Quince when it was a muddy field in summer 2018. He told me what he wanted to do, opening this place in March 2019. I thought he was insane, and then took the job for much less money than I was on. But it is the absolute blank canvas. He is committed to creating not just a haven for bees and other pollinators, but proving that pure sustainable land management needs no assistance. It can be done very easily and is profitable. And he's already proven that. What I'm going to try and do now, so bear with me, is I'm sharing the link. I'm not sure what you can all see or not, but I'm hoping this leads to a PowerPoint. Sorry, bear with me. This isn't happening, is it? Sorry. I'm just going to turn this off because it's not working. But I don't know how many of you have been to Quince, but please come along.
Pip, if you put the PowerPoint on your screen, you have it open. You have it the only thing that's open on your screen except for Zoom.
Ah, right, okay.
It should come up.
Provide a caveat. I know nothing at all about computers and whatnot, so right. Sorry for the silence in the meantime.
That's all right, everyone. Anyone, please use the chat function if you'd like to
go and pour yourself a drink in the meantime, yeah.
Or if you think of a question you'd like to ask later, put it in the chat function, and I will invite you to say it later, or Ricky will perhaps.
Okay. Right, so that's not up yet on your thing, is it? No. Nope. Ah, this is all going horribly wrong.
No, it's not. It's fine. If you see the button down at the bottom, share screen.
Yeah.
You click that.
That's not okay. Share screen. Yeah. There we go.
Yep.
Yep, you've got it all now. Dreadfully sorry about that.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
Oh, don't be sorry. That's fine, man. That's fine.
Okay.
That's great. Yeah.
Right. So I want to just explain a little bit because I'm showing off here, but about the kind of research I did for the EU, which was fantastic. So it really was being sent around. You'll see 3 pictures of a beech tree. The one in the top left-hand corner is well, someone's actually scratched 1745 in it. It's a beech tree, high altitude, about 1,200 meters. This tree is about 800 years old. The next one is just showing the different variation of growth. So as the tree disintegrates in on itself, it's not the same tree. This is a different one. about 1600 years old. And then you end up at the bottom with a tree that's 2200 years old up in Volvic. So my work was basically going around to these places and recording all of this. We could do it in the UK as well. So on the left is a tree actually in Stoke Gabriel in Devon. It's called the elephant oak. What you're looking at is the base, and this is a tree that's top growth, that's learned to balance itself. It's actually created a foot. Trees are not meant to be able to do this. So my job was going out, recording this, and then sending it back, in this case, to Lewes University, who could share this information. All the time, you're working with stuff where the locals don't understand what's important on their own doorstep. And as a way of aging trees, on the right-hand side, you can see a tree. Again, this is Stoke Gabriel. It was painted by Sir Thomas Walmsley, which is one half of the picture there, 250 years ago. Tree hasn't evolved very much at all since then. This is a tree which, if you ask any arboriculturalist, you'd estimate around 50, 60 years old. It's clearly closer to 600 years old. So we're dealing with the unknown, and I was always dealing with the unknown. We're getting back to Quince. The project at Quince was, let's just see what we can do. It's quite a big site. It's 54 acres. We try and farm as much of it organically as possible. It isn't possible all the time. Every area is divided out. Every single area is planted up for bees. September 2018, 80,000 plants planted, 3,500 trees planted. So we are the largest bee-specific arboretum in the world. And bear in mind, we're duplicating this every year. So we're now in 2021. And actually one thing that's been good with the lockdown is we've just increased and increased and increased. A lot of dry stone work. And one thing we have to bear in mind, given the topic of tonight, is why the demise of bees. Neonicotinoids, yes, are a problem. We're not going to pretend they're not. And any legislation that allows the moratorium to finish, as has happened, is bad news. But the bees were suffering hugely beforehand. We're not providing the habitats. We are over fertilizing our soil, and if most people would now agree, the big elephant in the room is nitrogen. We have to reduce our nitrogen consumption on agricultural land. One of the reasons why in North Devon, Quince Honey Farm can operate and make money is simply we're not actually using as much nitrogen as many other places, but we're still dumping lots. This creates a barren environment for the wildflowers which the bees desperately need. We can plant as many hectares as we want of wildlife friendly or nectar rich seed. It doesn't work. And I have to be honest, everything I've seen on general media, all the gardening shows, it's all nonsense. If in your head you have a picture of cornflowers and poppies in a wildflower meadow, I'm sorry, that's not what happens here. We need meadows, principally in corn grassland areas, which encompass many of the areas with our apiaries. You have yarrow, hemp agrimony, meadowsweet. It's boring. Yes, it's one color, but it's what the bees need. And more than anything else, they need hedgerows. The aim of the gardens itself at Quince Honey Farm, it's experimental. These are trial plots. So we have large trial plots, which reduce down to smaller trial plots within each area. Obviously, we have to cater for general public, and there has to be an element of fun. But that's all about interpretation. If people can go away realizing what they've seen, and then realize, hopefully, that there is no compromise between providing habitat for bees and all other pollinators, indeed all wildlife, and also having a functional garden, a nice garden, then we've won. And I think we are succeeding. These are just photoshops of various things. These are the gardens in the second year. And we've now realized that we need many more perennials. yeah, another point on the trees, being a tree person, every more trees are felled than any preceding year. And this year, the last year, has been exceptional. We are seeing so many trees felled, so many hedgerows destroyed. I'm not just talking about the big projects like HS2. We have to, Sheffield is a classic example. They were felling all the trees in Sheffield because everyone wants biomass production now. This all gets chipped up and is used for sustainable or eco-friendly electricity production. It isn't. These are street trees, chipped up, felled against the public's wishes, and then sold back to them for electricity. Importance of soil. I'm not, because seriously with soil, I can just go on for years. One thing there, though, salt deposition. Climate change is the other significant factor. It is happening now. Since Quince has opened, we had a drought in the first year. The second year, this year, has just been bizarre. Driest April on record, wettest May on record, still getting frosts in early June. The plants are so slow. On top of that, we're seeing an increase in salt deposition right across the whole of Devon and Cornwall. So, for example, typically before 1980, you would see about 80 kilograms of salt dumped per hectare per annum. We're now on about 270. It's killing off the heather. So we can no longer get a decent crop of heather honey, whilst we used to get about 3 to 4 tons of honey. We got half a barrel last year. No one's talking about this. And this is a very important point in regards to the European angle. We trialed over 320 species in the first year. We're now up to about 516. Had to rely on Polish and French research because, frankly, the research in the UK is lacking, seriously lacking. Poland in particular, going back to the Eastern European research, where they could afford to put 300 scientists who would just rhythmically look at every single plant and research it properly in regards to honey, the quantity of honey that came off those plants. One thing we're losing now, so I am continually being updated with research. Already many important scientific pieces are coming across are no longer in English, and this is a genuine worry, I think, for anyone in the UK who's seriously looking into keeping on top of the research. So these are examples of the research we use. This is a part of a French document that was shared across. Going into the British stuff, what you're looking at the moment is nothing more than someone counting bees on a plant, which works, but it doesn't give us the overall figure. So what we rely on is on this kind of data, which is nectar sugar mass. And to give you an example of just how, for example, if the garden media will say a dahlia is a bee-friendly plant, and I've actually watched people ripping out brilliant plants for bees in order to put in so-called bee-friendly plants, it is all the weeds. The very top plants, rubus species, bramble is the best. Bramble by far and away produces so much nectar, and indeed when the bramble flowers, the bees disappear from pretty much all the other plants. When you have a lime tree, borage, yeah, it's great, but it is mildly toxic, so we can ignore that. Broad beans are great, and then you've got your weeds, ragwort, and etc., etc., etc. Leave the weeds and tussocks. This is another important thing we're trying to do at Quince and trying to highlight. It's not just about the flowers. You need a messy garden. You need dry stone walls. You need mounds and log piles, and particularly tussocks for bumblebees. any F1 hybrid, and I have seen advertisals for sale in most garden centres, bee-friendly packets of seeds, but they're not. F1 hybrids do not contain the nectar that the bees need. You may see a bee supposedly feeding on them. They're not anything else from it. So clover, cheap, easy seed to buy. If you want to put a base layer down anywhere, just sow clover. Hedgerows are the most important factor, though, I think. Averaged out, this took an awful lot of research last year, but it was good fun to do. Worked out that the average Devonian hedgerow in a nice, thick, unflailed one will produce over 5,000 litres of nectar per kilometre per annum. It's that what keeping pollinators in this area healthy. Yeah, that carries on from that. Oh yes, the winner in 2019, plant a swede. Actually, this is another thing. Get some garlic bulbs in your ground, onions. If you just plant these seeds and let them bolt, they produce huge amounts of nectar, very, very bee friendly, and it's very, very cheap to do. Bee bombs, we've trialed them all. They don't work. They really don't work. You might get one or two frail looking things. Please don't bother. Nice little gift, but it's just utter nonsense. Stick a swede in the ground and you are really helping. Obviously, one thing with what we've done at Quince, by way of trying to help the honeybees, means that we really get the wildlife in. And my goodness, you come there now, it is extraordinary. We've got the lot. And certainly the grass snakes in the pond. So we're very lucky to have a visitor centre now where this is not a zoo. You're actually coming in and you are almost guaranteed to see most animals. The dissemination of science at Quince. We're taking this very seriously. So we have a number of ex-teachers, etc., who are doing the tours. It is very difficult, as you all know. Many of the tourists in North Devon are coming and they're expecting somewhere like the Big Sheep or whatever it's called. We're nothing like that. They are going to be lectured. Most people go away quite happy and satisfied with that experience. However, there are a number who really don't get it, really don't want to get it. We're just going to continue. So we've got so many. I mean, we're certainly with the nectar sugar mass ratio, this seems to be a real winner, and it's a very easy way of measuring just how effective plants really are. We're also planting. We're involved in many more local projects as well, a lot of community engagement. And certainly for me personally, it's about the actual soil management to mediate against climate change issues. Simple things like vertidrains, which work so well, where you just you're cutting off surface water just by digging a 40 centimeter deep hole and backfilling it with stone. It works brilliantly in getting that water down there, and therefore we can survive droughts much more effectively than most other places.
Pip, we need to wrap up. Well, I hate to say it. I don't even want to say it, but I just did.
Well, yeah, no, well, there you go. That's the final slide. These were the gardens taken this morning, a bit gloomy. You can see all the trial plots. Yes, we've got a lot of weeds. So if you don't like weeds, don't come to our place. But I hate to say it, that's what the bees need.
That's what the bees need. Yeah. Pip, thank you so much. Crikey, I said I like this. I feel chastened now because I linked you in with the Big Sheep and Milky Way. I should have said the Eden Project, but you know what I meant was it's well worth a visit. It's an extraordinary site. And anyway, can you stop sharing your screen, please?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And, no, don't be sorry. No, that was just such a fascinating talk. Please hang on because we got some Q&A, and I know there's already some good questions, some great questions in the chat, and some links as well. But rather than I'm going to move on to our, if you'd like to, people that go back to your gallery or whatever, because I'd like to call on our next speaker with a very, very fine shirt, and that's David Smallshire, a naturalist, well, an entomologist with a pretty impressive MAF and DEFRA CV, expert on dragonflies, larger than life. Ladies and gentlemen, please, a warm, virtual, silent welcome to David Smallshire.
Thank you, Ricky. Yes, larger than life due to sitting around too much during COVID, I fear. But anyway, good evening, everyone. I do know a few faces, but I don't really have the measure of many of you. So I will apologise in advance if I tell you what you already know. I'm going to add some bones to what Pippa's talked about in terms of the countryside being in a bit of a mess. And I'm going to waste no time by shrinking myself and sharing my presentation with you. So you should be getting that. Oh, go. Okay, hopefully you can all hear me well and see that. If you can't, put some messages up, please. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of agri-environment history to start with, and then go on to invertebrates, including bees and pollinators, of course, and wildlife in general, and the sort of things that we've done to them. We need to understand, I believe, what has gone on in the past. We do suffer as humans rather short-term memories, and it's useful sometimes to go back. I'm going to go back 50, maybe 100 years to try and put this into some sort of context. So firstly, let me introduce myself a little bit more. My day job for the first half of my career was working on invertebrate field crop pests. And that followed, thanks to the European Union's agri-environment schemes, with a change of career that thankfully brought me from the Midlands to Devon. So a wonderful move in many ways, a great job. Initially monitoring the success of environmentally sensitive areas and countryside stewardship, and latterly high level stewardship, which was still going when I retired 15 years ago. So I helped to develop the schemes, and latterly was a policy advisor to DEFRA. Alongside all of this, and indeed precursing it, I suppose, I've had a long history in birds. Birds have been my lifelong passion, but butterflies and inevitably dragonflies came. And then shortly after that, I was dragged into botany. I always prefer things with wings, as you can perhaps guess. But today, basically, I'm interested in anything wildlife. Okay, let's start by looking at land use in the United Kingdom. So it may come as no surprise that the majority, over 2/3 of the UK, is farmland. And that includes rough grazings, for example, on the moorland fringe. But that 68% is actually less than it used to be. And during the 20th century, we lost 1/4 of our agricultural land. So there's what was certainly 100 years ago, by and large, very biodiverse, rich countryside covering a good 3/4 of the United Kingdom. And that we have lost a chunk of before we even get down to how the cropping patterns and farm intensification has changed things. So basically, for the first half of the last century, we had a predominance of permanent grassland. World War II changed that. Many of the grasslands were ploughed up and put into arable, and some never came back. There were some reversions, because this was in the days when basically you ploughed and seeded something. and arable fields, in fact, reverted back to grasslands quite nicely in those days. We hadn't tampered too much with the soil. But certainly in the latter part of, well, certainly the last 50 years, we've had roughly equal areas of grassland and crops, and those crops being dominated certainly in the last few decades by cereals and oilseed rape. Okay, I don't want you to dwell on the detail of this slide, but the point really that I'm trying to make, or 2 points, is the first half of the 20th century, we had a really good mix of things. We had mixed farms. We had farms that rotated through cereals and root crops and grass rotations, and even bare fallows. So fields were left with nothing growing in them for 12 months. And these have now gone. We had farmyard manure was the source, basic source of fertilizer or fertility for the fields, and very few agrochemicals were used. To contrast that with the second 50 or 60 years on this graph, and you see massive changes, declines in crop diversity and specialization in, first of all, barley, that's the purple line, and then the dark blue line with diamond patterns is wheat. So wheat, and then latterly, just below them, oilseed rape came on the scene. So accompanying the increase in cereals and rape was a switch from spring sowing to autumn sowing. And that had an impact, not so much on insects, but particularly on birds that were reliant on the stubbles, the seed that fell to the ground during harvest, and also the seeds produced by arable plants that were growing in those essentially unfertilized or pretty unfertilized arable fields in the first part of the century. Moving on to livestock, you can see here at the top, sheep numbers trebled basically in the latter part of that period, so from 1950 onwards. And that resulted in the uplands, overgrazing of moorlands. So heather in particular suffered very badly from sheep grazing, locally also cattle trampling. But what went on unknown is that much of the grassland, in fact, grows in Britain, grows on heavy land. So clay soils are very prone during periods of wet weather to compaction problems. And sheep, actually more so than cattle, have caused most of the grasslands, certainly in the west of Britain, to develop a hard pan a couple of inches down or maybe less, that has really changed the soil fauna and also the ability of the soil to take rainfall away in a sustainable way. Cattle increased rather modestly and rather late on in that period, but there was a change to indoor housing of cattle, particularly during the winter months. And of course, when you have cattle housed rather than out in the fields, defecating as they should and producing dung beetles as they should and other dung fauna, we end up with slurry pits and slurry that has to be got rid of as fertilizer on fields. So we get atmospheric nitrogen problems from keeping indoor cattle and spraying slurry. And that nitrogen pollution, the atmospheric pollution of nitrogen, is another rather unrecognized but major problem, particularly to things like mosses and lichens. And of course, there were spills, slurry spills, accidents happened, and we did see a big increase in water pollution during that period as a result of slurry getting into watercourses. So, okay, so there's a modern representation, I suppose, of what a lot of Britain would have looked like for the first half of the 20th century. It's lovely, isn't it? There's lots in there and plenty of red clover, one of those wonderful pollen and nectar sources for bumblebees, but lots of other flowers in our meadows, our hay meadows, and our grasslands in general, even those that weren't cut for hay. But what happened in the latter part of the 100 years or so is many of them were converted to this. That is basically ryegrass. It will be a monoculture of one species. It may be Italian ryegrass in a short-term lay, maybe perennial ryegrass in a more permanent pasture. But you don't see many flowers in that. And what drives that greenery is nitrogen, is fertilizer applied from bags. So not from cow dung, although it can have that effect if you put enough of it on the land, but bag fertilizer. And it does that by giving grasses the competitive advantage. And you could take a nice floral meadow like the one on the base of that slide, and you could apply a high dose of nitrogen to it. And by the following year, you will have obliterated all of the sedges, if there were any. You would take out many of the flowering plants, and you would massively increase the growth of grass. Now, that's a figure that's often quoted. It actually refers to England and Wales, but a survey found that we lost nearly all of our species-rich grasslands. So basically that meant a half of all of the farmland in the UK became degraded during that period, during and after the war. And that has had massive repercussions on our wildlife. So here's something for you to think about. What's the biggest wildlife killer since World War II? Well, I might have preempted what I'm going to say by just talking about nitrogen, because that's what I think has actually killed more wildlife than anything else. And I'm talking particularly about artificial nitrogen applied often as compound fertilizer. So it would be with phosphorus and potassium, the NPK that go on together, usually with nitrogen dominating. That shows the massive increase in nitrogen fertilizer. That's the top line in that graph from, in this case, 1965, right through to about the late 1980s. And actually there has been some decline in nitrogen use since then, which is good news, but we still have a very eutrophic countryside. So eutrophic meaning it's got a lot of nutrient in it. And that has helped not just to drive agriculture, but to reduce the quality of our freshwater bodies, both standing waters and our running waters. I will just mention that although phosphorus is never applied in vast quantity, it does, when it's applied as artificial phosphorus, it adheres to particles in the soil and to organic matter, and it doesn't leach away from the land in the same way that nitrogen does. So nitrogen in a year or two will get washed down into the soil and into our rivers and beyond, of course, into our seas as a result of rainfall. It leaches away. The phosphate can linger for decades. So bear that in mind when you're thinking about rewilding our farmland. And what's been discovered experimentally is that the best results will often come from removing the topsoil. It's pretty drastic action, but taking away that nutrient so you're down to a fairly impoverished soil. And that's what many of our more desirable plants will thrive on. So just to summarize then, there was a period of about 40 years from the time when I was born, although I take no responsibility for it. We lost nearly all of our mixed farms, so we lost structural diversity on our farmland. We saw those massive declines in unimproved grassland and also in crop diversity. We saw big increases in arable crops, cereals, oilseed rape, and improved grassland. So those bright green fields that still, I'm afraid, dominate much of Devon. We saw large increases in applications of lime, artificial fertilizers, I will stress, and pesticides. We also, let's not forget, saw the advent of the tractor in the 20th century. And that actually, as well as ploughing up any ground nesting birds, the corncrake is a classic example of how we nearly wiped out a species from Britain by tractors, mowing for hay, basically. But we also undoubtedly massively reduced the numbers of large insects, such as grasshoppers, because they couldn't get out of the way of the machinery. So, as well as tractors doing the haymaking, which was typically late in the summer, we now have typically several silage cuts every year. So, okay, it's bright green grass and not much in it to start with, but it does get cut several times. So each of these individually and certainly in combination caused a massive loss in farmland habitat quality. Okay, before I get onto insects, we probably know more about bird population changes over the last 50 years than we do anything else. This is the tree sparrow, and it has the reputation, along with grey partridge and turtle dove, of declining by more than 90% since actually the mid-60s. It was probably a little bit commoner before that, as were the other two species. But these have been obliterated from quite big areas of Britain. And the common feature of these birds, and indeed many of the other farmland birds that have declined, is that they feed their chicks on insects. Tree sparrows we might think of as being a seed eater. They've got seed-eating bill, but they feed their young, if they're desperate, on cereal aphids, but also many other insects, anything that they can find, as indeed do house sparrows as well. So insects, quite an important part of these farmland bird declines. Butterflies, we know a fair bit about. There's been some monitoring done for a good 50 years now. And what's interesting is that if you break them down into the generalists, the things, roughly 25 or 30 species that will wander around the countryside fairly freely and have fairly common larval food plants, have not declined anywhere near as much as specialists. And the specialists declined during that period, here 1970 to 1990, quite significantly and haven't recovered since. There's a good Devon example. High brown fritillary Devon was once one of the strongholds. In fact, 30 years ago, it was one of the national strongholds. It still is, but we've got even fewer of them now. So big declines in some species, particularly the specialists. Moths, ditto. We have quite a good span of moth data from moth trapping. I won't really dwell on that. Insect trends in other groups. So here's a study of terrestrial insects. Over 3,000 species were looked at. Their distribution actually increased for the 1970s and 80s, which is quite intriguing. That's a general overall picture, but then declined from about 2005 onwards. Flying insects, we have some evidence that the numbers have been very significantly reduced in the last 25 years. So goodness knows what happened in the 25 years before that. Beetles, a similar order of decline in the numbers of species over a much shorter period. Though intriguingly, in these three semi-natural habitats, chalk downland, woodland and hedgerows, they actually increased. So interesting things happening where the habitat, the high quality habitat, remains. Freshwater insects, which start to get into the area I'm interested in particularly, decreased in distribution from the 70s to the 90s, but then recovered. And that may be a result of improving water quality in our rivers. So I've got to put one slide in about dragonflies, and here it is. I've got to ask you to keep this information confidential, otherwise I'll have to kill all of you because we haven't put the press release out yet. But basically, 50-year analysis of dragonfly data shows that 19 of our roughly 40-odd species have increased significantly in the last 50 years. 5 of these were new colonists or recolonists, and only 5 species at a UK level decreased. Now, these 4 species all occur in Devon, scarce chaser at the top with small red-eyed damselfly, and both new colonists in the last 15 years. The bottom 2 have declined nationally, the black darter and common hawker, and these are both upland, moorland, bog species in particular. So they're boreal species that may well be expected to decline as a result of a warming climate. And we have, rather intriguingly, seen evidence of that in dragonflies. However, one other species, one damselfly, has declined that we have some information on. This is a very common, one of our most widespread and habitat tolerant species, the blue-tailed damselfly, and that has been found by a very sophisticated study to be adversely affected by one of the neonics. So neonics getting into water, not good news. Okay, my last couple of slides. I'm sorry, I realize I'm nearing the end of my time. You're not going to like what I say here. We have one honeybee, and the honeybees, of course, are mostly from domesticated colonies. We have 25 bumblebees, only a few of which are tolerably common. All of the other 200 odd species are solitary bees, and these are major pollinators. So when we're talking about pollination, please let's not just focus on honeybee. There are lots of other insects out there doing it. The House of Commons were provided with this information a few years ago. So we have maybe nearly 6,000 species of pollinators. And these include bumblebees, solitary bees, honeybee, wasps, hoverflies and other flies, beetles, butterflies, moths. So a whole range of critters pollinating plants and trees. Pollinators have indeed declined globally. We do know that through habitat loss, through climate change, through pesticides, and through disease. The overall trend of pollinators is down, but not all species are declining. Some are threatened, while others are extending their ranges. Bees and hoverflies from a parliamentary briefing, this information. We have had dramatic losses in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, but that decline has slowed since then. Wild pollinators, intriguingly, a third of them had smaller distributions over quite a big period, but 10% increased their ranges. Pollinators key to European crops apparently increased by 12%, maybe supported by agri-environment schemes, or maybe just simply through planting oilseed rape. And 20 bees and wasps went extinct in Britain over the last century or so. But interestingly, at least 17 flower visiting bees, flies, and wasps were new to Britain in the last 20 years. So things on the move in places. Okay, so my final slide, summarizing really that we've had huge changes in our land cover and habitat quality in the UK, and not least in Devon. It's become generally very simplified and degraded, mostly due to post-war agricultural intensification. And fundamental to that change has been the application of nitrogen fertilizer. Insects and other wildlife have responded by general declines in diversity and biomass, not good news for the environment. Mobile generalists have generally done better than the habitat specialists. And there has been some range spread and colonization as a result of climate change, i.e. species increasing as a result of better weather, warmer weather that has benefited some species. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I think, yeah, I'm not going to go on to that. I have other slides if people want to follow up later.
David, thank you so much. I didn't chip in, and with respect to Pip, who I did chip in on, I had a private chat with Richard Toller, who is to be thanked soundly for putting this panel together. But that was just so fascinating. Teresa is, I'm sure, working out as we speak the Q&A, which I think we now unilaterally agreed will continue past the 8:30. We'll keep going because some of the questions are cracking, and I know that Pip and yourself, David, will want to respond to them. So hang on, call for extra drinks, etc. And because I'd like to bring in our third speaker, Mark Rogers. Mark has actually, I'm not going to introduce you, Mark, because you've already introduced yourself in a separate email to us, and I'll only be repeating myself, but it's a great pleasure to have Mark Rogers with us this evening, who's going to carry on. And
Firstly,
this is fascinating. There you are. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me? Because I'm using a really low grade mic and gizmos.
We all can. That's brilliant. Very clear.
Okay, brilliant. Technology is not really my thing, so unlike the previous two speakers, I haven't got any slides, so you just can't to look at me, I'm afraid, and listen to my droning on voice. I'm suffering from a bit of imposter syndrome, really, following those two, because my kind of my background isn't really based in the kind of research, although I'd probably would rather have liked it to have been. I'm a farmer, several generations as such, so I'm part of the problem. Well, as we all are, really, but there we go. I'm not even on my soapbox yet. I've kept bees for about 15 years, and I've grown fruit for apples for a similar amount of time. Prior to that, I was just primarily arable agriculture, and I've always kind of been a little bit left of the centre, and as such kind of fallen prey to a lot of the general agricultural banter over the years. It was actually Quint's honey farm and meeting Paddy and Ian that got me into thinking about bees as a potential sort of diversification on an arable farm. We'd already diversified into fruit, and we started keeping, when I started keeping bees, which was just entirely accidental. My uncle, who had kept bees on the farm previously, he had a course booked he couldn't attend. He had a hip that had to be resurfaced. I ended up keeping bees, and the way that it opened my eyes to the connections and to the sort of dependence that we as humans have on from the food that we eat on pollination and all of that was mind-blowing for me. What we do beekeeping courses now, as education's kind of become part of what we do. we diversified further with the bees, and actually rather than just selling honey, we also make cosmetics. And one of the things I try to leave people with when they go away is that, like Dave touched on, beekeeping has become a monoculture. You know, we've got in a hive, a decent sized hive this time of year, 30, 40, 50,000 bees, all our own, you know, choosing, breeding, real genetic cul-de-sac that we've driven bees down. I don't know if you'd agree about that, Dave, and just we've pushed bees like we've pushed all other agriculture. We've pushed it into, we've pushed it out of diversity into specialization, and we've put everything at peril through doing that, really. Previous two speakers talked a lot about nitrogen, and I couldn't agree more. You know, we just pile on inputs without hardly even considering whether we need those inputs or not. Anyway, I do get a bit ranty. So the importance of pollinators, like the previous two, and particularly Dave's slides, I wish I had that information on tap. The importance isn't just for our food, it's also the whole ecosystem. It's, you know, insects are the kind of bedrock of the whole ecosystem, that, you know, everything feeds from them. The soil feeds everything, but insects are a great way in between, you know, the soil and the rest of all the biodiversity, the birds, everything, you know. And also, as Dave with his slides really pointed out, although I'd still like to kind of bring up what I was intending to mention, was the importance of the other pollinators. You know, with beekeepers, we get this like pollinator god complex where we're like, everybody should pat us on the back and say how great we're doing because we're keeping bees. And actually, we're just kind of like just taking the glory for all the other insects that are out there pollinating. And pollinating much harder are bees because they have a big colony to fall back on. They don't need to work all the time, even in sort of borderline inclement weather. So kind of the solitaries, that it's all about survival for them. They're constantly hopping around from flower to flower looking for something to eat and pollinating in the process. I wasn't sure really the kind of scope of what was to talk about, and because there was an interest in kind of pollinators and the apple growing I kind of figured maybe we were more of an apple-y group. I'm picking up that's probably not the case. And so I'll try and talk a bit more about kind of the different bits and bobs rather than what I was kind of expecting to talk about, which was a bit more agriculture. The kind of power is with farmers and landowners, and really with like legislators, people who are lobbying and trying to push for change or status quo, and that I think one of the benefits of the European system was that it was a slow moving behemoth, whereas now I think we will become more knee-jerk reactionary to whoever can shout the loudest, sadly. And farmers and landowners, like I say, through what they plant and how will they maintain other scrubbier areas of farmland, and how they plan their mowing and their hedge cutting. Like Pip was saying, hedges are just so important to not just the pollinators, but so much of the biodiversity that we take for granted in England. And farmers, they could be benefiting from all this extra pollination through making small changes. And I feel like by putting all the kind of all the praise on bees and beekeepers and Apis mellifera, we're kind of unintentionally unraveling all the goodness that's going on in the background that we could look after very simply without the kind of level of input that we have to put into farmed colonies of Apis mellifera honeybees. In the past, I've been involved in like organic farming and conventional farming, and sort of sort of messing around with projects. And one thing I would say about all farming really is it should be based on soil analysis as the foundation, and nutrition being sort of planned around that. I've jumped into people's systems in the past following other employees, and so much of what we do as farmers or as farm workers is all kind of tied up in just the fact that it's our humanity, it's our like our hubris, our pride, our fear of change or fear of failure. And there's kind of a toxicity. There's two levels of toxicity within agriculture. There's the like toxicity that we just put on the land and we expect the land to kind of cope with, and then there's this toxicity in here where we're all, we've all got these biases that we need to overcome in order to kind of move forward. The ignorance isn't always willful. Sometimes it's just purely a lack of education, and I feel like that element of there's massive gaps, there's big, we're missing opportunities that would be easy to take to remedy some of the problems that we have, but we don't, because there's so many other things crying out for our attention all the time. I won't go on for much longer, but one of the things, like, to illustrate the point I was just trying to make was when I started spraying top fruit, it's always done in the daytime, and I would come back in between tanks to refill. And even if I'm spraying something that was considered to be insect friendly, there would be dead insects all over the equipment, the cab, the sprayer, etc. And I kind of thought about this, and I thought, well, this is bonkers. In my own conscience, I can't keep doing this. So I actually do all my spraying at night now, where there's way less insect activity. Obviously the wind drops. You're not going to come across a load of ramblers or people walking their dogs. You aren't going to be upsetting people in their gardens because they're in bed by then. I mean, the noise probably upsets them, but I feel like that's kind of like swings and roundabouts. And the difference that's made is epic for us, I think, anyway. Also being more considerate about applying insecticides, trying to avoid insecticides where you can, and manage positive predatory insects, really to sort of help as part of your arsenal, I guess. And I will talk a little bit about neonics. Are neonics the problem? Yes, the answer is they are part of the problem, but really the problem is us. And we've just created this massive perfect storm that's just, just pulling everything apart. I mean, maybe I'm going too far there. So we, within the last farm I was on, which was an arable farm, we took it upon ourselves to start planting bee forage, which Walleters have completely run with, and it's epic to see what they're doing now. And I'm really looking forward to coming up and looking at what they're doing again in their new site. But the sort of the quest that I was on was to make more honey originally, and so we planted up 75 acres of arable land all over to bee forage. So things like whatever would grow, really, along a similar view to the first set of sites, where we were just trying different seeds, some stuff that failed spectacularly that we would expect would be wonderful, and we were looking to find like an old oilseed rape, because my uncle, who had kept bees on the farm, he had these records going back, and there's we could see yields up and down, and then there was just this big down trend up, and we were thinking, well, what changed then? And we were thinking, oh, maybe it's the type of the breeding of the oilseed rape. So I went to a seedsman. I want, what were we growing 10 years ago? And he said, well, it's really similar varieties. Nothing's changed much that would change the sort of nectaries, the makeup of the plant. So he said, what we have changed is we've been doing these seed dressings, these much more advanced seed dressings. And I said, well, what are these seed dressings? And this is going back 11, 12 years. And he said, oh, neonicotinoids. And I said, well, you know, the seed that I buy, has they got these neonicotinoids? And I'm like, oh, yeah. Turned out that we had the seed dressings and we were still spraying for the same pests. And one of the things I'd sort of expected to talk about, if this has been a more agricultural thread, would be about the role of agronomists in all this mess that we're in. You know, we were having these seed dressings put on the soil, on the seed going into the soil. The plants then take the as the sap rises and they bring moisture into the plant, the chemical goes into the plant, to the system of the plant, that anything that eats that, whether it's the sap, the flowers with the pollen or the nectar, they take it away, take the poison away, and that's the mode of operation for it. And just if you think back to how driving a car was in the 80s and how many bugs you had splattered on the front of your car, you think about now, and it's not just aerodynamics. My cars ain't, you know, old and square and still don't have bugs sat in front of it. And I'm sure there's many Land Rover drivers out there that there's the same aerodynamic issues. So I often get shot down in sort of flames of anecdote because of my lack of what the previous two speakers had, which was experience in that scientific area of the field. But I just feel like I'd like to leave that with people, is that, you know, we've changed so much. It's the soils, it's the inputs, it's the technological advancements for the chemicals, and we all need to think about how we're all sort of complicit in that. Sorry, leave it on a high note. And that's kind of the end. I'll wrap up there. I'll keep it fairly brief. Is that okay?
Oh, yes, indeed. Oh, Mark, you're very self-effacing. Believe me, that was the perfect contribution, because let's face it, you are a farmer. You are a farmer, and what's more, an organic farmer. And I want to call it the chalk face or the
well, both really. I'm kind of I'll dabble in whatever I'm called for, really, but I'm always trying to push people into a kind of a lower input system if we can. Yeah.
Well, again, I speak for myself, for everybody. It's been an utterly fascinating evening for me. I've listened to so many TED Talks in my time, and this was up there with those. Thank you so much, all three. And you're still all three with us. So I will pass the chair, as it were, to Teresa, who will now deal with some of these classic questions. As to how they get answered, I'll leave that to yourselves. Thank you.
Right. Hello, everybody. Well, I've just got to, shall we deal with maybe the questions in the chat first? Start with Pip. Actually, I had a question to you, Pip, which was, you were talking about the increase in salt deposition.
Yeah.
Where does the salt come from? That was my question.
We're seeing a fluctuation in the jet stream, which means that there is much more salt. Let's go back. It is pure climate change. So we have a great blob of cold freezing water that has been deposited south of Greenland because of the melt. This means that our jet stream and Gulf Stream are fluctuating greatly. So when you get these extreme winds, which we've never really seen in this part of the world before, you have to realize that that also includes a huge amount of salt that is just scattered over the land. It's as simple as that. It is pure climate change. Quite why this is not reported, quite why this extraordinary event is not reported, I can only assume deep this stuff. It is affecting everything. And as a forester in the main, it is, when you hear all these tree planting targets about the UK, you can't help but think this is no longer possible. We are facing such short notices, periods of time where we can actually plant trees because of the fluctuation in the jet stream, the droughts, etc., etc. Land management has to become much more we really have to, the weather is becoming much more important. We really are working on a day-to-day basis. Right, we can do this today, we can do that today. we still know that we are getting salt all the time. It is a massive problem which is just hidden.
Thank you. Yes, I've noticed that in my garden as well.
Yeah.
It's very exposed to the wind. Tom Parsons has been a great contributor to the chat. Tom, I think you had a question for Pip as well, and also I think possibly a couple of questions for Dave. So do you want to unmute yourself and ask them, or shall I ask them for you?
I forgot what my questions were. You go ahead if you've got them in front of you.
Okay, the question was to Pip was, what was the problem with borage?
It's toxic. We're still awaiting research, and I think this is something everyone will agree on, where there is not enough research. There's not enough money ploughed into the research, but we have. Last year we were warned that borage is slightly toxic. We don't know how much. We know it's certainly bad for us, but does that mean that the honey produced from borage is also bad for us? We just don't know. But
it's not toxic to the pollinators.
We don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, it might be. We don't know. Certainly, okay, let's take buddleia. Everyone always talks about buddleia, the butterfly bush. That is clearly toxic to many other pollinators. Butterflies, but we just don't know. I mean, I think with regards to all of this, the research that we're trying to do at Quince and everyone else is trying to do, we don't know. We have to keep researching, and it's a very important matter in regards to neonicotinoids, because when the whole thing with neonicotinoids appeared, all the research money disappeared into that, quite understandably. So we're just placing stress upon stress upon stress without realizing that actually we're moving away from important issues with regards other issues, as it were. We need more money, but it's never going to happen.
Just going quickly back to the salt question, is there anything you can do to get rid of it effectively?
No.
Okay.
Reverse climate change? No.
Yeah.
It is. Whenever you hear about climate change rate on TV, I think we're about 5 years behind the actual status. Ahead of the actual status. It is affecting us now, and it is affecting us badly.
Do you mean in terms of like a lag time? So the warming we're seeing now is a result of what was burnt 5 years ago?
I don't think we have any clue, or certainly the media are not highlighting just how bad that it all is. I mean, I heard on Farming Today a £2.8 billion loss because of the weather conditions this year. 2.8 billion pounds. And this is climate change. This isn't an occasional event, a freak event. This is climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you.
Tom, you've got a couple of questions for Dave. You've said the species stats are based on abundance since 1970. Do you have any comments on changes before the 1970s baseline?
Unfortunately, there are no good data sets, and even in the 70s, a lot of the wildlife data were a bit sparse, so quite large margins of error. But I think from what we know about the use of pesticides, for example, like DDT, prior to the 1970s, it's quite likely that some of the trends we've seen over the last 50 years, we could draw the line back into the 60s and the 50s and so on, but we don't have hard data for many things, unfortunately.
Thanks, Dave. I thought that was probably the case, but it's just, you know, it's the shifting baseline syndrome, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right.
Kind of emphasised by the lack of knowledge.
50 years is quite good because it spans well, it spans my memory fairly well these days. But a lot of people of your age, dare I say, Tom, will think of 25-year data sets and actually, you know, don't go back far enough perhaps to get a bigger picture.
Yeah.
I'm not being critical of you personally there, Tom.
No, thank you. No, I was just thinking, you know, it's things like the marsh frip. Used to get caterpillars being shoveled out the doors in Ireland in the late 1900s, and there's been no reports of that sort of thing for, you know, since the late 1900s. Sorry, 1800s. I was also wondering the bee and hoverfly stats, which didn't sound too bad, with, you know, distribution generally increasing for quite a few species. Are those stats based pretty much only on distribution, or are there abundance numbers in there as well?
Some of these analyses have been using occurrence, occupancy data. So over the last 10 years, we've seen coming to the forefront a thing called occupancy modelling, which takes ad hoc data of the sort that biological recorders are very good at gathering and have been in Britain for quite a long time, actually. But taking that and producing statistically robust trends. And in fact, the dragonfly figures that I quoted have come from occupancy modelling analysis. It's way beyond my statistical level, so I can't explain anything more to you than that, Tom. So there are, if you like, it's a surrogate measure of abundance, and I think a pretty good one.
Okay, thanks. That's reassuring, because, you know, if it's just distribution, it doesn't necessarily tell you a great deal about how the species is doing, because things are going to distribute more widely if they're desperate.
Yeah, and of course we do have, as I mentioned with the butterflies, we tend to be able to break down species groups into generalists, which are generally doing rather well or better than others, and the habitat specialists that are far more likely to have suffered as a result of, well, things like the massive decline in the area of species-rich grasslands in the UK.
Yeah. One more key question, Dave, because that's an awesome shirt. Where did it come from?
I have to say it was a gift. I don't know. I can't.
Oh, okay. I was thinking of somebody else I knew would like a gift very much like that. But if you don't know, that's okay.
It is reserved for special occasions. So
excellent.
You're on.
Nice. Do well.
I'll
stop monopolising all the time now. Thanks.
Yeah, I took my sweaty string vest off earlier.
Okay, thanks. There's a question for Mark about apiaries. Jenny Schmidt, you there?
That's Tim. It's Tim using Jenny's computer, I think. Tim Potter.
Is it written down over here?
It was how many hives in an apiary or something.
Oh, okay. Well, the answer is always less than you think, we found. We get quite a lot of pressure from some landowners to put a lot more hives onto their land because they just, you know, perceive more is better. And the answer is impossible to give, really. But bees are like an open book. Once you learn to read bees, you can then read your local environment. Really, you can read what's in abundance, what's flowering, you know, and that'll tell you really quickly. If you choose to ignore it, you can have as many hives as you want in an area, and people end up feeding their bees. But it's about looking at the hive, and if it's thriving, great. But don't add more bees to that site just because that hive is thriving. Just think, oh, great, I won't have to feed my bees so much sugar syrup, rather than the general human nature, which is just to think, oh, I'll pile some more in there and we'll make some more honey. Sorry if that wasn't the answer that you're looking for entirely, but
thanks. Yeah. Now there's a Graham. You put something in the chat. Graham Lofthouse. Would you like to, or is it just a comment?
No, I'm munching on a biscuit at the moment. There's a comment my wife made about hedges and the loss of hedges, and the fact that hedges seem to be cut very, very low at the moment. And if they consistently cut them low, they'll die. And also in gardens, we've seen masses of hedges and foliage being taken out and closed board fences put in, which is not going to help the wildlife at all. So I just wonder what the thoughts are with the speakers with regard to that.
Bearing in mind hedges are
Gone.
he said hedges are very important for
Yeah,
bees.
yeah.
They're disappearing.
People, when you see a hedge flailed low, there tends to be a panic, and actually it's not a bad thing. When you see them actually removed and replaced with any kind of wooden structure, then it is a bad thing. But no, please don't panic. When you see a flailing that is done very low, all the evidence is that this doesn't actually do any harm to the hedge. I've never witnessed it. And indeed, it actually encourages the growth of the hedge and more species to come up in that hedge. But yeah, when we remove a hedge, then it can be extraordinarily damaging. When I was working for the Hercules project for the FP7, there was a 7-meter break in a hedge in Modbury, which resulted in flooding for the first time ever in the village. We have to remember that these are not just boundaries. They are extraordinarily rich. Indeed, they are the best thing I think that humans have ever provided to ensure a sustainable landscape. Underneath a hedge, you get a means of dispersing surface water, so you don't get flooding. The surface area of the trees and plants, you get a micro woodland growing in a vast area, which can increase the size of, let's say, a field. If you're increasing it 400 times more in surface area. These things are extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary. And in my opinion, they are the answer to so many of the issues in how do we sustain agriculture without compromising nature. But yes, if you see someone removing a hedge completely, certainly a built-up hedge, it is illegal. Do report it to the council.
can I interject there a little as well, or have we not got time?
No, carry on.
I do agree with what you say there, Pip, but from an agricultural background, I've seen some bloody awful hedge management. I mean, my family are guilty of sin for generations for just trashing hedges, flailing them at the wrong time, willfully, so that they would just, bring them back and back and back and back. Latterly, we were tenant farmers, and I mean, the tenant farmer has to be the biggest sort of adversary of nature, just because of the nature of the farm and the way that you have to squeeze every drop out of it, up here. And I totally agree. I mean, hedges are an incredible resource. I've laid, kilometers and kilometers and kilometers of hedgerow, And flailing, geez, man, it's got some real things to answer for. And I think there should be more of a, you know, pressure on farmers to actually plan when they do flail. Like you say, you can use it and take it right back as long as you let it grow back up. But a lot of farmers will flail and just to try and, you know, subdue a hedge.
May I chip in? I'm going to be controversial here because I'm not a great fan of hedge laying. I actually think, well, let's start at the bottom. The hedge banks that we have in Devon are by and large fantastic. And in many cases, they are the most important parts of hedgerows because they're the reservoirs of the wildlife that formerly existed in fields. And now they've had to retreat back to hedgerows. So in some cases, making the best of a bad job. But let's not forget the hedge banks themselves, the earth, some cases the stones, but they're a huge wildlife resource, and they do enable, as corridors, they enable wildlife to get around the countryside, particularly obviously the less mobile stuff and plants as well that will creep very slowly along hedgerows. What's on top reaches maximum biodiversity value if it's left alone. And that may be decades and centuries. So my optimal hedgerow is a line of outgrown hedgerows that have gone to maturity, and some of that old growth becomes fantastic for the immobile things like mosses and lichens, for example, as well as producing perhaps huge amounts of nectar and fruits and berries and nuts. And so my ideal hedgerow management would be to do nothing for 100 years. Okay.
I agree with that.
Yeah, no, I'd go with that. Yeah.
So I told you I was going to be controversial, but I actually, when I worked for DEFRA, I engaged with a number of people who made hedgerow management machinery. And I said, why don't you create something that straddles a hedge and bashes it around a bit like a very messy hedge layer would do, and that mechanically puts down something to hold the whole thing in place. And that way you might get a lot more hedges laid. That was a solution to those who advocated traditional hedge laying, which we know is very labor intensive and very expensive to do. And maybe there was maybe that didn't involve putting a flail along it every year, which is the worst possible thing, I believe, for hedgerows.
But laying's a good way to bring a badly flailed hedge back to some kind of value. I mean, if you'd seen some of the hedges on our farm, they were just barren, you know, they were just totally barren at the bottom, and they were flailed within an inch of their life every year. Yeah. And laying them gives them a chance to actually spread, fill the voids up again. And like you say, the best hedges are ones that have been left for 100 years.
Yeah, I mean, lines of trees are great. They are remnants of what native woodland would look like, and have extraordinarily high levels of biodiversity in them, considering they are lines of woody material.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And anybody else like to chip in with a question? No, otherwise I'll hand back to Ricky.
George, please ask your question.
Oh, thanks, Ricky. Yeah, my question was about the environmental land management scheme, which has been heralded as being the solution to environmental problems, paying farmers for environmentally friendly practices and so on. And that could be reduction in the use of nitrogen, it could be more wildflowers in the meadows, it could be good hedgerow management and so on. But it seems to me that it's all sort of kind of disintegrating into sort of one big sort of mess and nothing really happening. I just wanted to, particularly from David, but from DEFRA point of view, does anybody do any of the panel hold out any hope that elms could actually be a solution to these problems, or you know, or is that just sort of total wishful thinking?
Can I start? I can no longer speak for DEFRA and don't wish to. I don't, from what I know, believe that elms will be massively different to the agri-environment schemes that we've had since the late 1980s. The prescriptions have become more refined and the advice that accompanies them has been. But what was always critical was getting the land managers' engagement and understanding of what the objectives and outcomes were. And I'm not convinced we've gone massively towards that. We did try, I was involved heavily with the development of higher level stewardship, which is now, well, there are still some agreements working through their periods, their management periods. But that was attempting to paint a picture, if you like, to farmers and agreement holders about what the outcome would look like, and giving them a little bit of flexibility to manage the land in the way they thought was appropriate, with obviously with some advice and help where needed. But there was a massive amount of advice and encouragement and knowledge transfer required to enable agreement holders to do this. And that's quite expensive. And the EU at the time didn't really pay for that. And the government didn't either. We put our 50% towards the payments, and that was basically it. So I'm not massively hopeful, and I still speak to colleagues who work in Natural England now, because that's what my organisation morphed into, and they're not very optimistic about how things are going to go. So I'm sorry not to put a rosier tint on things, but I'm being honest there.
Pip, do you want to come in there?
I can't really. I think they've answered properly. Is sad.
No, you were shaking your head.
No, I wasn't. I was in full agreement.
Yeah. No, you were shaking your head in answer to the question. I thought probably. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think it's a very rosy picture, and I think until the funding changes, there won't be the kind of big blue sky thinking that will come with like a more desperate understanding of how grave the situation is. Status quo really is, or they're just looking to avoid bad headlines. They're not really looking to change anything in a way that's going to mean anything. Sorry.
Yeah.
Teresa, shall I
Yes.
draw to?
Yes.
Well, we've gone past the witching hour. The caretaker's just come in. I've just got my slippers on and shaking my watch. I just want to. Okay, I'll start off with some thanks. I'd like to thank Richard Toller and Lorraine Matthews of our group for putting this fantastic panel together. Also, Teresa, of course, who's the brains behind the organisation, and Ian for putting the Eventbrite together. But seriously, Pip, Dave, Mark, you've done us proud. It's been a fascinating evening, and the full accolade to you is the fact that we've only lost half a dozen people, which is, believe me, that's quite hysteric even. Thanks ever so much. I presume the recording will be kept. Teresa, how might it be accessed by one or two individuals who've asked?
I can download it, and I can send the link to anyone who is interested. So so yeah, through
Yeah.
probably, I think if anybody's interested, they should email North Devon, is it Northern or North Devon for Europe? Wait a minute. I'll put North Devon. No, the email is actually North Devon
it is, yes.
at gmail.com, and I'll put that in the chat now.
And that's the other thing. There've been some very good references in the chat to websites. I just saw one for the hedgerows that Tom put through. devonhedges.org. That sort of link will be fascinating bedtime reading for some of us, I'm sure. But I think probably keeping and sharing the chat will be more complicated. But don't forget, everybody who's got their cameras on, you are being seen by the eyeballs in the sky. On behalf of us all, thank you for joining us, and thank you for staying with us. But once again, you can always turn your mics off or just do this. What am I doing there? Do that. And thank our 3 speakers, because you have been excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
In which case, I will leave it to Teresa to close the session. Thank you, Richard.
No, thank you very much, everybody, for coming. We've in Northern Devon for Europe, we've been looking to expand our interest. We're a very close-knit group, really. We've stuck together through the lockdown, and we've found that we've all got lots of different overlapping concerns, and climate and the environment is a really big one. So this is the first these type of events that we've had, and I think it's been really excellent speakers. Do look for us on Facebook, Northern Devon for Europe, if you want to keep in touch, or email me. I've put the email in the chat, and we hope to see you again. Thank you very much.
Oh, it's nice to see Bert Bruins. Hello, Bert.
Yes.
And Ian's got his hand up, but I think that's just his way of waving goodbye. Thank you, Pip. Thank you, Dave. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to all our speakers.
You're welcome.
Yeah, and thank you, Ricky, for chairing it.
Cheering it.
Bye.
Oh, Janet, hi.